Good day to you. And before I get started with this very first chapter, I want to say that the author of this textbook, Fred Yant, was actually the department chair who hired me in my very first position as an assistant professor in 1989. I never got to know him that well, but he's written what has become by far the most common and popular textbook on intercultural communication. And this edition that you're reading happens to be the most recent edition, which includes some social media stuff, so you're getting a really good book for the class. In this first chapter, what we're really considering is identity and how culture is related to identity, and then we cruise through a bunch of terms that try to get us to have an understanding of how deep this idea of culture and intercultural communication really is. There's a lot of different components, and it's tough to get a handle on it. Don't get frustrated if you end up being more confused about some things than others. Let's take it from the top. We know, at least based on Fred Yant's research, that most of the human beings today consider that their languages all originated in Africa. Yeah, Africa is where oral language originated, then it branched out and moved to the Middle East and Asia and eventually over to the Western world. We know that human beings themselves and also language comes from Africa. From there, the professor and the author of this book, he wants to talk about 6 elements that help shape identity when considering culture. So let's go through those now. The first one is religion. Religion was the oldest, and at one time was thought to be the most powerful form of identity. If you were a Christian, that was your main association with identity. If you were a Muslim, that was your main association with identity. If you were a Chinese communist, even though we wouldn't call that a religion, we would call it atheism, it still would be your defining identity. Religion still plays a great role for many people today, but it generally, historically thinking, is on the wane compared to some of these other elements. The next one of which is what we call the national and cultural identities, and this idea of a nation state. I don't know if you've ever had a philosophy class, but nation state is something that's defined in it. It's when you have all these little collections of communities that started to form themselves into countries with central governments that would govern them. So you would have the emergence of Germany, for example. You would have the emergence of Greece instead of Sparta. You would have the emergence of what we would call countries, but really the sociological term is nation states. These are places with borders, they're places with governments, and they are places that generally think of themselves as a whole. And so the nation state used to be the main organizer of a person's identity. If you were an American, I'm an American, and that's what I am. I am not a Canadian. I am not a New Zealander. I am an American. Or I am a Puerto Rican. We have a lot of Puerto Ricans going to East Stroudsburg University. That nation-state idea was the second element that came to define people. And in considering this particular element, Fred Yant takes a look at how part of that nation-state has to be that the population is self-sustaining. That means that it can take care of itself. It can feed itself, it can heal itself, it can educate itself, it can improve itself. It has to be self-sustaining to be a nation state. We also know that there are various patterns of behavior that come with growing up in a nation state. For example, why in the United States do we not have a 13th floor on elevators? It's because it's an unlucky number. Where does it come from? I don't know. Maybe some of you know, but you won't find necessarily in other hotels in other countries the idea of an unlucky number for a place in a hotel. We just accept it, just like we accept that you rub a rabbit's foot. Just like we accept when we meet somebody, we give a handshake, whereas in Japan, you will bow to a person. These are things that come to being in a nation state. Also, what comes with being in a nation state is this idea that there are certain values that are not open to discussion. For example, if you grow up in the United States, capitalism, we'll talk about it. We'll talk, capitalism is all about money, but we won't criticize it as a system that should be brought down in favor of something else like socialism or communism or authoritarianism or militarism. It's just not open for discussion in our country. So that also characterizes a nation state, that there are patterns of thought and behavior that are expected, and that includes values that are not open to legitimate discussion, I guess you would say. All right, moving on now to the next element that helps form identity is class. Class is the idea that based on your wealth, and in some cases your blood, if you've ever heard of what a blue blood is in England, that's a person of a royal background. We still have many countries like Saudi Arabia where we have royal people that are families and their descendants are automatically anointed to be the next leaders. That's what class is sort of all about. It's about how money and occupation and how the status that goes with those two things create a culture for you that sort of governs what you drive, for example. Are you a BMW family or are you a Subaru family? I had a friend from high school say to me, I've never met a Subaru owner that I liked. And I thought that was very interesting to me. It's categorizing a kind of a class according to Subaru, because that's a company that's been known as quirky, and they're into the environment, and people who drive those vehicles tend to be green and ecologically minded. And it's just interesting how class can also shape your identity. Depending on what occupation you go into. As a professor, I interact with a lot of professors at ESU, and there are ways that we have that we speak with each other, ways that we analyze problems and solutions and talk about critical thinking that are unique to our class of professors, and you will have the same thing in your occupation to some extent. The next element that Jant talks about as influencing identity is gender. Now, he doesn't go on to say too much about gender in the book, and I think that's because there's still being some heavy-duty thinking going on with gender, especially because of transgenderism. Bruce Jenner, a recent example, bringing this other dimension of homosexuality versus transsexuality versus heterosexuality versus bisexuality, and whether those have anything to do with gender in and of themselves, which basically breaks down into whether you are a male or a female. The latest thinking that I know about is that gender is something that is more like a sliding scale. Some people have very, very strong and completely only, quote, masculine traits. Others have very, very strong and completely, quote, feminine traits, whereas others fall somewhere along that grade, that they have some feminine traits but they're masculine, or they have some masculine traits but they're feminine. Those are my own personal thoughts on that subject, but gender and identity is another way that we think about culture. Yet another way that we think about culture, have thought about culture, is race and skin color. And in the early days, we know that there was a white privilege system that was built up based mainly on slavery. The white man in particular, wasn't even the white woman, even in the United States, a country that was fairly progressive, didn't have legal rights, and many legal rights, until the 60s. And we still obviously have a lot of racial difficulties between police officers and African American males. I'm not saying that any particular side is at fault here. I'm saying obviously that this is an issue still in our country that we are very sensitive about. And it has to do with race and skin color, the color of your skin. Right here in Mexico, the darker your skin, the less of a chance, I have to say, you have at becoming a white-collar professional. The lighter your skin, the greater chance you're going to work in a bank as opposed to cleaning houses, for example. It's a fact about Mexico, and it relates back to skin and race. We do know that race, technically speaking, is a biological and a socio-historical combination. Look at that one in the book. What it's saying is a lot of it has to do with your genes, but it also has to do with the environment that you grow up in. It's a mixture of both. And by the way, on that note, I hope you do read every detail in the book. If you want to do well on the quizzes, read those shadow boxes that Fred Jant puts in there, read the case studies, etc. Moving on now to the next element that influences culture, we've got civilization and identity. This was kind of weak in my view in the chapter. Civilization has to do with a group of people that have set up a way of life. They've colonized a country, and that's just grown, that their civilization has grown up within that country. For example, we know that in the mountains of Tennessee, there's a Scottish population that settled there, and they still do many things Scottish, including playing bagpipes. I guess we could say that is a civilization as an example. Civilization, another element relating to identity. From there, Fred Jant goes into talking about subcultures. He wants to make the point that subcultures are considered by some to just be a smaller version of a larger culture. For example, I can say that for myself, I am an American, but a smaller subculture version of that is that I am a British American because my parents are born in Britain. I told you about that. You have similar backgrounds depending on your lineage and where your parents are from. So subculture is also a way of looking at culture, but subculture can also be looked at as being looking down on, like they are the anti-establishment people or the troublemakers. So sometimes that term has a negative connotation. We know that within subculture, the main ones that we consider are ethnicity being people of similar descent and heritage. People who come from West Africa, for example, consider themselves to be very different in some cases than people who come from East Africa, because of the descent in history. We also know that coculture is another way of looking at subculture. Coculture tries to get away from the idea that subculture is inferior by saying that no, it's not that you happen to like to ride motorcycles, but you also happen to like to dance ballet that makes one or the other greater or smaller or better or worse. It's that you are a member of both of these cultures, which normally wouldn't go together, ballet and motorcycles, but you happen to be into it, and therefore it's going to be equal in terms of the status of it in your life, and that's what makes it a co-culture. From there, Professor Yant goes on to do a case study of American Indians. I find that personally very painful to read, knowing the plight of the American Indian, especially compared to Mexico, where you do see indigenous peoples still have a strong place, and their race and ethnicity is not as diluted because there was not the massacres, the number of massacres in the U.S., but he does an interesting study of the American Indians as a subculture. And then he talks about subgroups also as subcultures. We are all members of subgroups. Subgroups are people who share small little activities in common, sometimes related to their professions. If you're working as a waitress this summer, you know what I'm talking about. There's a subgroup of waitresses. If you're a bodybuilder or what we call a lifter, it's another subgroup. It's another way of looking at subcultures. And now we move to the end of the book, where we talk about, to the end of the chapter 1, where Professor Yant talks about communication and its role in culture. And he says that communication really has two functions in creating culture. And one of those functions is communication is the means by which behaviors are regulated. For example, you go to a baseball game. One of the behaviors that's regulated is when the national anthem is played, you stand up, and if you're a male, you take off your hat. Now that's whether you want to or not, you just do it because the pressure to do it is not only are people asking you to do it, but everybody standing around you is doing it as well. So that's the means by which your behavior is regulated. That's one function of communication. The second function of communication in culture is it's the way that groups and individuals interact with each other. This is how that we share ideas and thoughts. This is how we speak to each other and gain meaning. This is a very important part of culture. This is how culture is formed, especially if you consider it, as I do, to be the way that you are raised. This is how you were raised in large part. It's by the people that you communicate with. So I consider that one to be very, very important. Only two more things to talk about now for this first instructional video lecture. And the one is that there are various components of communication. Now, I'm not going to go over those components. You should have had those if you had an intro to communication class, speech communication, one of those. It's the communication model with a sender, a receiver, a source. I'll leave you to do your own digging up of that when you check out the book. But finally, I want to mention media and communication, which is where this chapter ends. It's very important that we understand that the internet was largely born in the English-speaking world. English is largely, predominantly the language of the internet, even though the language that's spoken by more people across the world is Chinese, followed by Spanish. English, though, is the language that was started in computers, and so most computer content contains English. And so we're going to keep our eye on that later on in this book, in this class, as we see how the internet and social media, which are redefining culture, because you have all these associations through Twitter, through Snapchat, through Facebook, through Pinterest, through everything that you do on your smartphone, that now we are really seeing a transformation of what defines culture. So we're going to leave things there. This wraps up our first video lecture on communication and culture, Chapter 1.